His best guess was that he'd stolen a wizard's grimoire, for what other kind of book could be valuable enough to warrant such elaborate defenses? But he'd handled a couple of those in his time, and when he leafed through it, he didn't find the elaborate pentagrams and illustrations of mystical hand gestures he was expecting. What he did discover were lines of text, pictures of leaves and flowers, and 100 smells, many exquisitely sweet, faint, yet still perceptible, even though the musty, nose-tickling odor of aged decay, parchment. The dark street was narrow, and the towers crowded close on either side. Mary found it oppressive, considering that she was comfortable in even the deepest reaches of primordial forest, like the Chandal Wood, with gigantic mossy trees looming all around. It was ridiculous, but true nonetheless. Well, at least she had a patch of open sky above her head once more, and hope of completing her mission without the necessity of a return to the claustrophobic confines of the underways. In fact, if she could only ease her mind on a certain matter, she might feel better than at any time since Aaron Randell made off with the saddlebag. The problem was figuring out how to broach the subject with a comrade who'd been nothing but helpful, who had indeed saved her life. As a general rule, Mary believed in directness, yet she had a sense that in that situation she'd feel like an ingrate if she failed to muster a degree of tact. "I still can't make out how you knew," she said as she hiked along. "About the mystic Delave's face," Cephres replied. "Yes, we broken ones can see through illusions sometimes. Open eyes are a benefit of our meditation." As they neared an intersection, Cephres pointed to a frieze in manticores decorating a crumbling wall and said, "That is where our informants told us to turn." Mary peered around the corner, studying the path ahead. Even up in what was allegedly the law-abiding part of Weeble, it appeared to her that an absurd number of folk were skulking about in the dark, engaged in business that, were it wholly legitimate, they would have conducted by day. But none of them looked like they were lying in wait for outlanders, so she and the monastic proceeded on their way. "But how did you know she was so worried about keeping her scars hidden that a threat to unmask her would break her will?" the ranger asked. Cephas shrugged and replied, "It was a guess, based on what we'd heard and seen. Her reclusiveness, the dim lighting and frilly furnishings, her taste in reading material, and the fact that the false visage she affected was absolutely perfect, like a statue's face." "Very clever," said Mary. His cane tapped the bow, outstretching a strained strip of linen tied over his eyes. A beggar meandered toward the two women. Reminded of Sir Randall's disguise, Mary scowled, and the blind mendicant, who evidently saw her forbidding expression perfectly well, veered off. "Thank you," Cephas said. "Yet I sense you don't wholly approve of my tactics." "It's not that exactly. I suppose I'm trained to fight with my hands, not by finding a person's private shame and rubbing salt in the wound. It just felt dirty somehow." Cephas arched an eyebrow and said, I intended to master the wizard through the exercise of our martial skills. You stopped me. Because unlike the Yuan-Ti who tried to enslave me, she hadn't done anything that made her fair game. Operating a haven for the foulest kind of outlaws and goblinkin doesn't qualify. "It seems like it should," Mary said with a sigh, "doesn't it? Yet you pity her." To her surprise, Mary thought she heard a trace of scorn in the monastic's generally calm, mild tone, and she wondered if it was directed at Nanitha or herself. "Consider this, then. Suppose something scarred you. Would you spend the rest of your life hiding in a hole? No, it wouldn't make all that much difference to me, I suppose. Nor me, nor anyone who wasn't bloated with vanity to begin with. Whatever distress Mistress Delave experiences is the result of her own stupidity and weakness. You and I are not to blame. And her deity is tender Ilmatar, God of mercy," said Mary with wry incredulity, whose sympathy and help are given first and foremost to the innocent, and who strive for the right, like you, my friend, and the good folk who you say will benefit when we recover your stolen treasure. There, that's it, isn't it?" The scout peered and saw that Cephas was right. Ahead and to the left were the broken foundation of two spires, like decaying stumps in a row. One tower had evidently fallen sideways, demolishing its neighbor in the course of its collapse. Imagining the catastrophe, Mary winced at the probable loss of life. But it had happened long ago, and all of those unfortunate souls were beyond her power to help. What mattered then was that if her informant, one weeble apothecary, had told the truth, Aaron Sir Randall lived on the top floor of a tower 3 doors further down. Mary and Cephas stalked forward, stepping silently and gliding through the shadows. The ranger spotted a hobgoblin lurking in a recessed doorway, its cloak draped so that it half concealed the crossbow dangling in its hairy hand. She stopped and raised her hand, whereupon Cephas too halted instantly. Mary pointed. "A lookout," she whispered. "Yes, I see it now. Aaron's sentry, do you think?" "It's possible, but it feels wrong. At the Paradin, his accomplices were all humans, and if I understood Nanitha correctly, he doesn't even belong to a gang himself. He might not have any partners as a general rule. Well, whoever it is, it's likely no friend of ours, not unless you have other allies you haven't told me about. No, Mary replied. I can't fling a chalk room that far, but you can surely hit it with an arrow. Mary reached for a shaft, then left it in the quiver. I can't just kill it without knowing for certain who it is or what it's doing, she said. It might be working with the Grey Blades. A hobgoblin? I know, it seems unlikely, but Weeble is full of townsfolk the rest of the world disdains as savage marauders. Maybe some of them even spy for the law. What should we do then? Cephas asked. Creep around to the back of the tower and look for another way in. One the watcher can't see. I'll do that. You keep an eye on the hobgoblin and this approach. And hoot like an owl if you need to alert me of anything. Cephas smiled and said, I remind you, this isn't the wild. This must have a foul owls. No, they must have a few owls, Murray replied. Anyway, we need some sort of signal. She started towards the alley that ran between the two buildings, and the door of Aaron's tower opened. Several ruffians, a couple humans, and others not, skulked out onto the street. The one in the lead was a Tanaruk, the first of the infamous breed Mary had noticed among Weeble's motley population. Stooped and massive, curved tusk jutting from its lower jaw, it stalked along with a heavy battle axe in one fist and a lead line in the other. The trailing end of the rope bounded the hands of a human prisoner who hobbled as best he could with a burlap sack over his head. For a moment, Mary wondered if it was Aaron, then decided it couldn't be. The captive was excruciatingly gaunt, not lean, and carried an assortment of old scars on the exposed portions of his skin. The hobgoblin lookout emerged from the doorway to join his comrades. Mary laid an arrow across her bow. Cephas touched her on the arm. What are you doing? She whispered. Mary was surprised that a broken one, sworn to help the victim of cruelty, would ask. I'm going to shoot an outlaw or two, the ranger replied. Why? We don't know this is any of our affair. The toughs and goblinkin look villainous enough, but perhaps they have some legitimate grievance against this man. Then let them go to the law with their complaint. I thought that's what towns are supposed to be good for. How many acts of injustice and brutality have you seen since coming to Weeble? Asked Cephas. How many chained thralls wailing that they were enslaved unlawfully? How many pimps beating their whores and bravos terrorizing shopkeepers for protection? Yet you passed on by because you're on a mission, and if you deviated from it to right every wrong you stumble across in this den of scoundrels, you'd never get it done. Maybe we don't have to close our eyes every time. Sometimes, no, something about the plight of this particular wretch is stirring my sympathy. But surely your guild masters taught you that mere emotion is no reason to abandon strategy. I admit they did, but uncertain, hating Cephas a little but herself more. Uncertain, hating Cephas a little but herself more. Mary watched the kidnapper. If that was what they were, lead their captive away. All right, Mary said when the street was cleared. Let's get this done. She promised herself that once it was, and she delivered the strongbox into the proper hands, she'd depart Weeble within the hour, never to return. Unless it was at the head of an army to raise the filthy place. She and Cephas scurried into the tower and on up the shadowy spiral stairs. The risers were soft, treacherous, half-rotten, but they managed the climb quietly, even so. On the third floor landing, a door opened, and a halfling in a feathered hat started to emerge. He took one look at the two grim-faced human strangers striding by and retreated back inside. The door to Aaron Randall's garret apartment was standing open. Mary and Cephas ascended the remaining stairs wearily. Then they peeked beyond the threshold. Someone had torn the flat apart. At first, the exercise had likely been a search, but had included simple, malicious destruction before it was through. Shards of shattered bottles littered the floor, and the varnished scraps of a broken mandolin lay in the wrecking puddle of it spilled wine. No one was inside, though Mary was reasonably certain she'd seen the vandals only minutes before. Look, Cephas said, pointing. The light of the garret's one surviving lamp suffocated to reveal the outline of an axe scrawled in crimson chalk on the wall. The red axes signed their work, and plainly Mary said, "It was them we saw coming out of the tower with their prisoner. Otherwise, the coincidence is just too great. Curses, we should have waylaid them." "Perhaps so," the monastic replied. "But let's take a moment to think it through. Who do you think they abducted? Aaron's father? Somebody dear to him, at any rate. Someone they hope to trade for the box. Not a bad idea, and if we take the hostage from them, we can try the same thing." Mary frowned and said, "We're not kidnappers. To hold a man prisoner and barter his life for treasure. Do you think the captive an innocent? My guess is that he's as wicked a knave as Aaron himself. For what bond of affection could exist between such a thief and a righteous man? We can mistreat him just on the basis of our suspicions." "No," Cephas sighed, "of course not. What was I thinking? I think this evil place is corrupting my judge." Without warning, she leaped and spun, her heels streaking at Mary's head. Reacting out of sheer reflex, Mary bounded back out of range, and the monastic's kick missed her by an inch. The scout continued her frantic retreat, meanwhile knocking and drawing an arrow. Zephyrus landed in a deep crouch, one hand high and open, the other clenched into a fist and cocked at her hip. "What is this?" Murray demanded. "Why would you attack me?" "The Arcanoloth promised you'd guide me along the path to the banquet, or to the bouquet," Zephyrus replied. "But I think you've done your part. From this point onward, your mawkish scruples and squeamishness would only get in the way. So now I'm going to kill you for daring to set yourself against the Lady of the Lost." Mary didn't understand all of that. She didn't know what an Arcanoloth was, for example, but it was plain that Zephyrus was as treacherous a double dealer as most everyone else she'd met in Weeble, and had been playing her for a fool from the start. "I'm the one with an arrow aimed at your heart," Mary said. "If you so much as twitch, I'll let it fly. Now you're no broken one. Who are you? Perhaps you've heard of the monks of the Dark Moon." Zephyrus' hand leaped towards her pocket and the chakram inside it. Mary released the bowstring. The arrow flew straight, but the monastic twisted aside. The chakram whirled through the air. Mary simultaneously ducked and flailed at the ring, and by luck, as much as skill, she swatted it away with her buckler. Steel clashed against steel. Zephyrus pounced too fast for even the deftest archer to ready another shaft. In desperation, Mary swung her bow like a club. The monastic caught the weapon, twirled it out of Mary's grasp, and cast it aside. At least that took an instant, which Mary used to scramble backwards once more. The retreat took her out onto the balcony, which groaned and dipped alarmingly under her weight. She also had time to snatch out her broadsword, and when Zephyrus lunged forward again, prompting the platform to creak and lurch, meet her with a stop cut. The robbed-shaven head woman halted instantaneously, cleanly on balance, and the attack fell short. Smiling ever so slightly, Zephyrus shifted back and forth, looking for an opening. Mary felt an unaccustomed pang of fear and struggled to quash it. "I know she's good," she thought, "but the sword gives me the reach on her, and she can't dodge around it much out here. The balcony's too small." Mary advanced, feinted to the head, and cut to the flank. Zephyrus ignored the false attack and swept down her arm to parry the true one. It shouldn't have worked very well. The broadsword should have chopped into her wrist, but the block incorporated a subtle spinning motion that somehow permitted her to fling the blade away and remain unscathed. She reposted with a spring into the air and a front kick to the face. Mary swayed backwards out of harm's way and slashed at the other woman's extended leg. She gazed the flapping hem of her robe, but that was all. Zephyrus touched down, spun, and caught the sword with a crescent kick. The impact tore it from Mary's grasp and sent it flying over the broken railing. The ranger grabbed for the hilt of the dagger sheathed at her belt. Hands poised for slaughter, Zephyrus whirled around to face her. Wood cracked and screamed, and the balcony swung down. The horizontal surface became a steep incline. The platform was pulling loose from its anchors. Zephyrus turned and, nimble as a cat, clambered up the slope and onto the safety of the garret. Mary tried to do the same, but scrabble as she might, she couldn't catch hold of anything to pull herself up. Her boots kicked away rotted fragments of railing. Wood cracked and snapped, and she and the balcony plummeted, tumbling through empty space. As the crash sounded below, Zephyrus drew a calming breath. She hadn't feared Mary's bow or sword, but she had felt a twinge of alarm when the balcony unexpectedly gave way. The fear proved she still had a way to go before she achieved a perfect contemptuous indifference to the well-being of all unworthy created things, herself included. It was something to work on in her meditations, but not just then. She had to recapture the opportunity that was receding beyond her grasp. The monastic retrieved her fallen chakrams. She then sprinted back down the spiral stairs. As Zephyrus hurtled downward, she cast off. She wished for all time the habits of speech and the expression she'd adopted to impersonate a broken one. The warmth and compassion of a servant of Ilmater were entirely alien to her own nature. It had taken a constant effort to counterfeit them, and she knew she hadn't managed perfectly. Still, she'd passed muster right up until the end, and that was what mattered. When she reached ground level, she raced down the street in the direction of the kidnappers and their victim had taken. She kept it to the shadows as best as she could, but stealth was less important than speed, and her sandals pounded the well-rutted earth. Indeed, she nearly passed the narrow cul-de-sac before she registered the stairs at the end of it, like a well lined with steps twisting downwards into the ground. When she spotted it, however, she stopped cold. The part of Weeble that knew rain and sunlight did possess some semblance of law and order, no matter how corrupt or ineffectual. So it seemed unlikely that outlaws dragging a prisoner along would opt to continue in the streets when they could descend to the underways instead. Zephyrus bounded down the narrow, unrailed steps, indifferent to the possibility of a fall. Her Dark Moon training had honed her sense of balance to such a degree that the rapid descent was no more difficult than sprinting on level ground. The real challenge came when the stairs deposited her in a twisted tunnel, the inky darkness relieved only by the smears of phosphorescence on the walls. Peering around, she saw nothing to indicate in which direction the red axes had gone. Accordingly, she listened, hoping to sense they'd returned below. The toughs would start taunting their victim or gloating over their success. In her experience, such mindless and undisciplined behavior was typical of robbers and goblin kin the world over. She thought she heard catcalls and laughter echoing faintly from the right, and she hurried in that direction. She judged she was heading more or less toward the river, though the maze-like warrens were ahead. The maze-like warrens were already muddling her sense of direction. She rather wished she could cast a spell of tracking or guidance to keep her on the proper course, but the simple fact was that no sorceress could master every conceivable conjuration and enchantment, and such tricks weren't a part of her repertoire. As it turned out, she didn't need them. She rushed or skulked past various scenes of the sort of underways provided in such abundance. A burglar selling a silk wedding dress to a dealer in such stolen commodities, ruffians and apprentices squatting in a circle throwing knuckle bones, several orcs closing in on a human who'd managed to draw his dagger but looked too drunk to wield it properly. The kidnappers came into view. Unfortunately, they still had such a lead on Zephyrus that she wouldn't have spotted them if the length of tunnel hadn't been unusually straight, or if a brothel keeper hadn't hung a scarlet lantern to lure patrons to the doorway of his establishment. She loped too close the distance, meanwhile pondering the tactical parameters of her situation, not with trepidation, but simply in order to manage the coming slaughter as efficiently as possible. Her foes were many, and she was only one. They had crossbows, which could shoot their quarrels considerably further than she could fling a chakram. The non-humans could see considerably better in the dark. She, however, possessed her own advantage. The enemy didn't know she was trailing them. Even more important, the red axes were simply ruffians, while Zephyrus was an elite agent of the Lady of Loss. possessed of all the lethal skills a dark sister required. A single spell could thin out the toughs in short order. Unfortunately, the drawback to the approach was that the prisoner was limping along in the midst of the outlaws, and he looked frail enough that any magic potent enough to incapacitate a half-dozen bravos was likely to kill him outright. Zephyrus was still trying to think her way around that aspect of the problem when the folk ahead turned down a side tunnel. Afraid of losing them, she quickened her pace yet again, but even so, she was too late. When she peeked around the bend, she found that the way dead-ended in a massive oak door reinforced with iron, more likely the sally port of the castle than an entranceway to a common residence. Plainly, her quarry had passed through.